Plastic model collecting is just like Pokemon. You gotta catch them all. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale Russian T62 main battle tank. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and/or purchase. However, as I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. This model here, being 172, is outside of my normal working purview. However, if anyone is interested in the scales that I do offer commission build services in, I can be reached via the email address listed below, info@eastcoastarmory.com. The model here is built mostly out of the box. However, I did deviate from the kit supplied parts in order to add some extra scratch build details in order to bring the model up to the way we see it here. In this video, we're going to be giving the model a thorough in-box review, as well as going over several aspects of the build in order to improve upon, and basically what it takes to get the model built up to the condition that we have here. Because of that, there's going to be a ton of info coming right at you, so just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this here is the Soviet T62 main battle tank. The T62 was a Cold War Soviet tank design that entered into development in the late 1950s timeframe and then was adopted by the Soviet Union in the early 1960s and saw service for several decades past that. During the 1950s timeframe, the mainstay of the Soviet Armored Corps was the T-54 and the T-55. These were originally designed at the tail end of World War II and then entered into full service in the early 1950s timeframe. However, during the 1950s, the Western countries were developing new MBTs, such as the M48 Patton, as well as the Centurion, and the Soviet High Command was concerned that their armament found on the T-55 was not going to be able to be suitable enough for dealing with these new tanks that were entering and beginning to be fielded. At first, they decided to perhaps upgun the T-55 with a new turret and bigger ordnance. However, it just wasn't feasible to do that with the size that they were working with, so it was decided to just design a brand new tank. This new tank design was going to incorporate many of the design concepts and features that the Soviet High Command liked on the legacy vehicle, but we're going to further make enhancements to it to improve it all that much more. Some of the concepts that were brought over into this new tank design were basically the low silhouette. The Russians really loved the whole concept of the low silhouette, and the T62 was going to have the basic general layout as the T55 in terms of its suspension and transmission. However, they were going to go a step further by making the turret even squatter compared to the T55. However, in addition to the turret being lower profile, it also had increased armor. It was also experimented to have ceramic balls found into the turret castings to give extra added protection against heat rounds. However, this is something that didn't really work out all that well in production, and I believe was eventually dropped. In order to achieve the squat low profile of the turret, the T-62 was the first Soviet tank to be equipped with the infamous autoloader. The autoloader became a standard on Soviet tanks, and it's something that we still see today on current Russian vehicles, for better or for worse. For the main armament, the vehicle was going to be equipped with the 115mm U-5TS smoothbore. With the use of a smoothbore, this allowed the T-62 to be able to fire fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds, which was something that was going to give this vehicle an edge and was going to penetrate some very thick armored enemy tanks. Automotive-wise, they just basically kept the same system that was found on the T-55. The system worked, it was in full production, no need to reinvent the wheel. Same is also true for the suspension. The road wheels, as well as the sprocket and track, are all carried over from the legacy vehicle. The vehicles were adopted in 1962 and entered into full production. About 22,000 and change were produced in total, and the vehicle, even though it was supposed to be the mainstay of the Soviet Armored Corps, T-55 production did not halt, and T-55s were still being fielded by the Soviet Union. In addition to Soviet usage, the T-62 was also offered as an export vehicle, and several other countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia did utilize the T-62. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage ESCI 1/72nd scale Russian T62 MBT. The ESCI 1/72 scale T62 is a really interesting kit. The kit itself is, of course, a vintage model kit. However, it's one of those vintage kits that are still with us alive and well today. This one, of course, however, is the original OG release by ESCI, and this kit here dates back to about 1988. For anyone who's a fan of the channel, you'll know that I've done several kits from this company in the past in both 1/35 scale as well as also an increasingly number in 1/72 scale, and there's a good reason to that. For the longest period of time, these kits were extremely prolific, and the quality on them was also equally matched. ESCI, for those who don't know, is an Italian-based plastic model company that started in the 1970s timeframe, ran their course throughout the 80s, however, by the mid-1990s timeframe, went belly up. During their time of production, they produced a wide range of model kits from airplanes, but more importantly for the purpose of this channel, their military vehicles. They produced kits in both 1/72 scale and in 1/35 scale. The 1/72 scale kits started in the 1970s, where they primarily focused on World War II content. However, in the 1980s timeframe, they decided to go all in on what was at the time modern military vehicles. And the T62 here is definitely one of them. What's really interesting to point out is that this kit here was really one of the only options available for a T62 during this time. The only other T62 kit that was available was in 1/35 scale, and of course that was the old school kit from Tamiya. Another cool kit, I do have one in the lineup, and that'll be the topic of a future model showcase video. But outside of those two options, that was basically all the builder had available for T62s. It wouldn't be actually up until very recently was when the market caught up to the old school kit over here and produced kits of this vehicle type in just more modern tooling. Namely, we have some kits from Trumpeter, as well as now recently some kits from Zvezda. Both are really cool. Both one day I'll hopefully get on the channel, but for the time being, we'll just stick with the old school ESCI one to start with. So as I mentioned before, these kits here were released by the company ESCI back in the 80s. And for US distribution, they partnered up with Ertl. What's interesting to point out that there are several options out there of this vehicle with the original just release versions from ESCI without the Ertl logo on the box. This one here has the Ertl, and then there were several other versions of the same kit that were released just with slightly different box arts. We also, again, have this kit still with us today in the form of being released by Italeri. As I mentioned before, ESCI went bankrupt in the 1990s timeframe. However, many of their kits wound up from several different manufacturers, but it seems like that the lion's share wound up with Italeri, and they still produce the ESCI kits to this day. The T62 is definitely one of them. And it's frequently in their release lineup. Every so often, they bust out the old molds, crank out a batch, and then set the molds aside for a future date. And it seems like recently, I think they actually did come out with a re-release of this kit. Either way, the tooling is exactly the same. It's just the outer portion of the box, and maybe the decals are a little bit different. It's also noteworthy to mention that ESCI made two variants of their T62 kit. This one here is just a standard T62. The other one is what is erroneously known as the T62M. I'll go ahead and throw a picture of the box art on screen now so you get a good idea what I'm referring to. And that kit is definitely a miss because they accidentally confused a Chinese Type 69 with a Russian T62, and the two are very different from one another, and it's definitely one of their misses. However, keep in mind at the time, the Iron Curtain was still up, so getting really accurate information about these things wasn't really that easily come by. So we can forgive him for that. Maybe I'll get the T62M one day. I'm a little on the fence about it because of how inaccurate it is. Maybe I'll get one for the just for the gigs. But anyway, back to the one that we have here. So now that you know the background, let's go ahead and actually go into the box art and graphic design. Like with many of the other ESCI kits, specifically in this scale, by the way, this one still has the shrink wrap on it, so as you can see. So in order to get a good idea what the box art looks like, let me go ahead and open up the shrink wrap, otherwise you're going to be harassed with glare the whole time. But I always mention, whenever you're working on a vintage sealed kit like this, you always have that Highlander type feeling and effect because, well,
there can be only one.
Okay, so this thing has been sealed literally since the 1980s, and it hurts opening it up, but At least it's on camera, and it's being archived for you all to enjoy. Okay, so with the cellophane off, rest in peace. Let's go ahead and look at the graphic design. So here we can see the graphic design over here, and just like with all the other ESCI kits of the era, it's on this white background type layout, which we see from other kits like from Tamiya, but also Italeri did the same thing. The illustration is really, really good. It's obviously a T62. It's got a cool camouflage pattern on it. Not really sure if it's Russian or if it's some other country that utilizes this vehicle, as the Russians didn't really go into camo too much, but that was something that was done specifically by the other countries that received these vehicles. Either way, it's a cool box art. The rest of the graphic design is as follows. We have here the ESCI logo. Note it has the Ertl logo accompanying it. We have here the T62 MBT in the same typeface that we see on the other kits that I've brought to the table in the past. On the reverse side, it's the exact same thing, only we have the track little illustration here on the reverse side, and we have decals for the Soviet Union, because that was definitely a thing of the period. Obviously, it's in 1/72 scale. We have the CE mark over here. Not really sure what that's for. I think it might be for importation reasons or something, but either way, we got that nice logo right over there. On the side tab over here, we have the standard ESCI red type banner, which is an attractive box art, admittedly. The boxes are very thin, as you can see, again, for 1/72 scale. We have the thumbnail image of the illustration in question. This, by the way, for those who are interested, is kit number 8340. T62 MBT with the ESCI logo. It's the same thing on the reverse side, but this one has definitely seen some sun fading that I mentioned before. Oh, by the way, like I mentioned before, these kits, this kit here I picked up off of eBay. Came in about a week ago, so it's a really fresh addition to the stash. And these kits are still fairly commonly found. I picked up this one for, again, under 20 bucks, so I think I paid 12 for it plus 5 for shipping. Either way, that's generally how you tend to find these kits on the market. The distribution on these were pretty good, and again, a large number of them have been produced over the years and are still in production today. So because of that, the produced numbers are pretty high, which means availability is somewhat easily done, which keeps the prices fairly low. Or controlled, I should say. Either way, I wanted the old school one because that's how I roll. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and look at the remainder of the graphic design. We have here a barcode over here. Just some warnings on the side over here to not eat the thing. And we also have some more corporate info on the other sections. Obviously, these kits were in many markets, so we have the same verbiage in a multitude of different languages. Okay, let's go ahead and crack the box open. Like all of the ESCI kits, they are side tab opening. And let's go ahead and pour out the contents. Okay, so first, right off the bat, this one's kind of interesting that it didn't come sealed in a hermetically sealed bag. This is like something we've seen on several of the other ESCIs in the past, so the fact that it doesn't have the bag is quite interesting. But again, this one was originally, the whole thing was sealed, so bear note. Okay, so starting with the instruction sheet, here we have the logo. By the way, a lot of times you'll see the ESCI logo in this type of format. But here we have the instructions. Again, old school drawings at their finest. And these are on par with the other old school drafted type drawings that are found on the other ESCI kits. Part count is pretty limited. It's 1/72 scale, so I'm expecting a fairly quick build. Dish over there, external fuel tanks. Gives you a little log. Pretty cool. And we have a little illustration here for a camo job, which may or may not be painted on this one. We'll see how that pans out. Okay, so the kit itself is all molded in this tan plastic, which is something that we've seen on other ESCI kits in the past, like the Merkavas, for instance, and even the M48A5 that I did. Anyway, let's go ahead and look at the quality. So the quality on the ESCI kits were always ones that were pretty decent and aged fairly well on some of the other kits. On this one over here, I could definitely see that they took some shortcuts, or definitely maybe they just didn't know. Again, the Iron Curtain was still a thing at this time, so some guesswork was probably there. And also, perhaps they had some limitations with the molding technology they had of the era. So, it is a vintage kit. Some modern builders out there will probably scoff at it, but those guys tend to be elitist snobs anyway, and let's just say their opinions tend to not really mean much to me. Okay, so let's start with the turret. So we see the turret right over here. It has the correct round shape of the T62. It's a freaking perfect circle on these things. But the side is where things get interesting, and you can see it has that nice flat dome appearance to it. As for the geometry, it seems to be on par for the T62. I don't really see a problem over here, and more or less it looks like it'll do the job just fine. Here we have the bottom portion of the pan right here. We have the side sections of the hull. They do have the torsion bar and swing arm details integrally molded on, and they look pretty good for the task at hand. On the T62, there are these struts that come out of the lower hull. They are absent on this older schooling kit here, but that is a data point I do want to mention. We also have here some of the suspension components, namely the sprockets, which are fairly soft in their detailing. They do have their teeth molded on, but are very, very soft in the geometry aspect. We also have the row wheels, and yeah, the row wheels are definitely not one of the kit's high points, I'm just going to say right now. But they do have the starfish pattern to them. They should paint and weather well, but if you're looking for something with higher detail fidelity, spoiler alert, this is probably not going to be the kit for you. We have here the turret handles, which are separately molded. That's a nice touch. We have the mantlet right over here, some separately molded headlights. Again, nice in that regard. These front idlers, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, are definitely very soft, very minimalistic in their detailing, and again, are not the kit's high point. So that is something, again, to bear in mind. For this kit here, they should be fine. I do like the way they rendered the geometry of them, with they have those little pegs that stick out. We see that in a lot of Russian tanks, like the T-55 is definitely one that does that too. But again, the outer appearance is, yeah, it's definitely soft. For this build here, should be perfectly fine. But again, if you are looking for something with really high detail fidelity, yeah, no, this is definitely not going to be the kit for you. The external fuel tanks are separately molded, so seam work that is going to be needed to be contended with, which is quite commonly seen on these builds. We have the antenna base over there. Yeah, should work just fine for the scale. Alright, so that's all there is to that. I'll get to this runner in a moment. And this takes us to this sprue over here, which gives us the upper hull. Upper hull is actually pretty decent. We do have some nice moldings on these sections over here. The moldings are pretty crisp, which again, for the area that we're talking about over here and the scale that we're talking about, is something that is quite commendable. We do have all these sections here that have the lids that need to be glued on. They are separately molded, which does give for better detail accuracy. The bow hatch looks good. It's molded a bit flat, but the detailing is still there. We have the filler caps right over there on the front for the fuel tank. The grill work, a little simplistic, but it'll do the job. Specifically, once that panel line accent goes in there, it'll definitely spice it up a bit. And yeah, it looks like a T62. We have the embossed detailing here on the tin work, as well as the little rubber sections that are found on the rear area. We have the front tin work with the locking latch right over there for the hinge. Looks great, actually. We have the nice little toe points that are for the front and rear. Those look excellent for the era and the age and the scale. We have the searchlights. We have the hatches right over here. You can see the detailing on them. Nice detailing overall on them. They came out pretty well. Some pieces here do have some flash, but again, that's something that was more acceptable back then during this era. We have the lids. We also have the extenders. The extenders look pretty good. I like the way they molded this section in. It looks very nice, and it's actually one of the kit's high points. And that's all there is to this, and this takes us to the final runner here. We have a decal sheet. I'll get to that in a moment. But okay, so let's look at this section. So the lower hull, just flat. It doesn't have the embossed stampings like what we see on the real T62. It's just a flat belly plate. It does have that iconic blower section right over there. That's integrally molded on. The plastic is nice and thick, so assembly should go together pretty well. That's a positive attribute. And we also have here the external fuel tanks. They definitely have the look and feel of external fuel tanks found on these vehicles. And all the geometry is there in the right areas. We have the rear plate over here. Simple plate, obviously the parts just get plugged onto it. Here we have the main armament, single molding, like what we see on the other ESCI kits, which is great, no seams to contend with in that regard. And we have the snorkel tube right over here with a little bit of flash, but that should clean up pretty easily. Actually, no, it's not flash at all. That's actually the curvature as it gets glued onto the rear of the turret. So, I stand corrected on that. Now, this takes us to the Caterpillar track. So, just like all the other ESCI kits of the 80s, this kit is plagued with individual link and lane track. Not exactly a fan of those. My hatred for these are known far and wide, but I have had decent results with assembling them in the past. And this one here, I'm going to utilize my pontoon trick, and I'll go into that in more depth in a moment, so you get to see exactly your best chances on putting these stupid things together and having them come out halfway decent. Most of the time, these tracks are crap, and the end result, more often than not, looks like ass. Don't care what anyone says. I've seen all the techniques. I've seen builds on the internet. I've seen builds on YouTube that have individual link tracks, and it's like, yeah, I can tell you have individual link tracks because the tracks suck. So, like I would say, if you are plagued with working on a kit that has individual link tracks driving you mad, saying which idiot came up with these, go ahead and blame that sheet because they're the ones that gave us this herpes that's been on the market ever since. So, another thing about the wheels is that you'll notice, like on many of the other ESCI kits of the 80s, the wheel is a solid plastic tooling in that there's no center divide line. On all tanks out there, the wheel is a two-piece assembly that's bolted to a hub, and you need those two wheels like this so that the center portion, the guide teeth can slide into. On the ESCI kits, the wheel's just simply molded as one solid wheel right over here, and there's no guide teeth molded into the track. It's definitely one of the weaker aspects on all of the ESCI MBT era of kits. And here you get to see the track over here. So it's a complete debunking of the individual tracks look more realistic. No, they don't. They never did. They never will. Just, again, cost-cutting measure. Because look at this. I can mold everything on one runner here and don't have to waste more material for a single-piece vinyl track. Which is a side note. The ESCI World War II tanks had single-piece vinyls, and those are the ones from the 70s. Then they decided to pinch some pennies and go with these, and then that's why they more likely went bankrupt as the 90s rolled in. But then this cancer has been with us ever since. Okay, so I could bitch about these tracks all day long, and I have. But anyway, let's look at the quality found on the molding. So the molding on the track links themselves are not bad. They're pretty decent for what they are. They're on par with like the Merkava and the other vehicles that I built from them. The outer track surfaces look pretty good. They do have that nice little chevron detailing found on the T62 or T55 track. The individual sections do have quite a bit of flash on them, depending, again, welcome to the 80s. This was normal back then. These days, people would be turning their noses up at them, but that's something that's easily cleaned up. A lot of people tend to make a bigger deal of flash than it really is. Just a sharp X-Acto and a few swipes, and you're done. But, that's just how we did things back in the day. The teeth are molded, or I should say the end pieces are molded so they could fit on the sprocket on most of the links. We'll see how that goes together. And it's going to be interesting to see how the pontoon trick works on this one here. So far, it's really good results with the pontoons, and I'm not expecting any difference with this one here. And we'll see what that looks like momentarily. But anyway, so the external tracks look good. The interior portion of the tracks are decent, where they do have the inner hinge detailing integrally molded on. The only thing that is missing, of course, are the guide horns. So take that for what you will. Alright, so that's it for the plastic bits, and this takes us to the decal sheet. The decal is a water slide decal set, and this one here is just on a blue paper backing. Sometimes it's on white, sometimes it's on blue. Just depends on, I guess, when these things were printed. And on ESCI decals, I've had mixed results with them. I've had hit and misses on them. Sometimes the decals came out excellent, and sometimes less so, where the pieces don't even survive getting dunked in the water. Of all the kits out there I've seen, the ESCI ones haven't really aged the best, so in the past on some builds, so it's going to be interesting to see how these pan out. The decal quality itself look like old school Italy decals, the best way to put it, so we'll see how that pans out as the build goes on. But if you're seeing this video in the scene before it doesn't have markings on it, you'll probably guess what happened. So just letting you know how that works. But we'll see how that pans out as the build goes on. Hopping forward a little bit takes us to the point where we have here where the model is fully assembled and it's actually ready for painting. Well, not fully assembled, mostly assembled, and I'll go into that in a moment. The model has also been modified with a little bit of extra scratchable detailing in order to kick it up and improve and polish the model compared to the original offering. Generally, it's easier to show these features at this point of the build as opposed to when the model is fully completed. Either way, let's go ahead and crack in. Also, if you are a fan of my 1/72nd scale work, specifically my ESCI work, you'll know the first thing I'm going to be referring to, and that is looks are misleading. The model looks like it's fully assembled, but it's actually not. That is because the suspension is not yet glued on. Let me go ahead and remove the turret first. Then I can show and reference a little bit more in depth on the suspension. So, of course, the model does have the dreaded individual link and length, and you are screwed with having to use it, so it's one of those things where it's a sink or swim type situation. But, as I mentioned earlier, I do have this technique that I incorporate on these 172 ESCIs that work pretty well. And that is with the use of what I refer to as the pontoon setup. So, at the moment, you see here the wheels and the track all fully assembled, and they are fitted to the model, but they are not yet glued on. You see, these units here are still removable, as you can clearly see. This is probably the best way to go about doing the individual link and link tracks because it allows you full access on the locations here to get everything thoroughly primed and painted, let alone weathered. One big problem that link and link tracks have is that and also a lot of people even do this with single piece vinyls, which is just baffling to me. When they're building the model, they go ahead and build literally the whole thing to like the way we had before, where the tracks are on and the thing was ready for painting, and they build and paint it and weather it in that format. And that's completely, in my opinion, the worst, wrong way to do it. For the simple reason, you have a lot of nooks and crannies in here, and you're just not going to get the paint to get into these areas. Also, if you think to yourself, well, I could paint and carefully paint around, yeah, well, you're going to have an entire area here that's going to be left bare plastic. And on top of that, it just makes the job even harder to get in there with the paintbrush, make sure you paint only the right areas and not any collateral damage. With this type of format over here, it streamlines this immensely. You have the entire setup, it's right here, it's freestanding, so you can go ahead and paint, prime, weather to your heart's content, exactly to the way you want it, and there's absolutely no risk of there being any collateral damage or even missed paint areas found on the model itself. Some people might say, the missed paint areas aren't that bad of a thing. Yeah, they are, because you see, no matter, and again, guys, I'm speaking from personal experience here, even though you may think you painted everything, you may shine the model in a certain light or an angle, and boom, you're going to be getting completely visible of bare plastic exposed. It's not great. It's the worst. I cannot stress this enough. It is the worst possible way to build any tank model, let alone one with individual link tracks or even vinyl and even workable track links I've seen people do. It's just mind-blowing when I see that. Don't do that. Don't be that guy. Do it the right way. Anyway, so the way you see the tracks here is the best you're going to get with this kit, and they go together fairly okay at best. There is going to be some hand fitting here or there in order to get the pieces to fit on appropriately. Also, another thing you want to pay attention to is orientation. There is a track orientation on these type of tracks, and you can easily make the mistake of installing them upside down. If you do, well, you're pretty much screwed at that point, and hopefully no one will notice it. But otherwise, yeah, you have to pay attention to that. The wheels are fairly easily glued to because of how large and wide they are, so that is a aspect of the build that simplifies it a little bit, but it's one of those things where you really want to take your time. As for the fit, I remember I did have to remove a little bit of material off of the center portions of the holes because the pieces were tightly fitting, which is normally okay, but when you need the pieces to be temporarily removable, that's something that can cause some problems, and you can actually break stuff as opposed to helping and aiding you. And that's not beneficial. So with a pin vise, I just carefully open up the tolerances ever so slightly with a drill bit that's basically the same size, and then that was enough for the clearances for the pieces to slip in place. Basically, to assemble it, you put the model upside down like this, you slide the wheels in place, make sure they are fully seated. So with a piece of Plastruct strip or something like that, you just press against the sides, make sure everything is fully seated where they need to go. You carefully add a drop of glue on each of the row wheels, and then you place the segment of track onto them and you fully let it dry. Make sure the track is on in the right location, where you want to have, as you can see right here, you want to have a little bit of material or space on the wheel on the center portion, because you do have two other links that need to be shoehorned in these two areas over here to achieve the bend to get to the front and rear portion. So that's something to keep in mind. So you basically orientate the tracks into the appropriate location and you let it dry. After that's set, you then go and you remove the single links over here and you add them to the appropriate locations too. The trickiest part is with the idler and also with the sprocket. Sprocket I'll circle back to, but the idler, because you're going on an angle now, the thing's a bit fiddly. There's not a whole lot of material here, so you want to be careful and you want to pace yourself. Key word is be careful. You take your time. The suspension should go together okay. The hardest part, though, is with the sprocket. The sprocket is where the link and link tracks on this kit really fall apart, literally and figuratively. So, as we see, the sprocket does have teeth integrally molded on. However, they don't exactly time or correspond with the holes found on the track itself. Hopefully it gets into focus right here. Will you? Yeah, thank you. Alright, so in order to do this, if you're trying to go through this building and try to just shove the links into place, they're not going to time, it's not going to work out well for you. So what I did was, I did a little bit of a life hack. On the sprocket, I actually sanded away and filed away the teeth that would be normally interlocking with the track in the curved section over here. With that material removed, I'll now have a smooth surface, much along the lines as the front idler here, and I was able to take the individual links and drop them into the appropriate location, and they offered no resistance or any other type of issues with the sprocket itself, and it went by pretty well. If you're careful with it, you should achieve the look that we have here, where you get pretty much your cake and eating it too. You get the look of the sprocket, but you get the appropriate timing of the track itself. This is something that is normally verboten on larger scale models, but in 172, it did the job just fine. The other thing to mention about the Indy links is that they don't really fit together. Specifically the single ones. There were some excess flash on several of the links, and this had to be carefully carved in order to fit them in place, and even where the hinge sections interlock, they still needed a little bit of hand fitting as well. So for those people out there who say that they look realistic, no they don't. They just don't. They're awful. I can't stand these goddamn things, and again, I always like to take a nice dump on them in these videos. But I was still able to muscle through, and basically what you see here is the best you're going to get with the stock tracks. There's no other way you're going to achieve a better look. On the top portion, it does have these two segments over here that angle inward to adjust for the track slack, and it looks okay, and the center section here does go on without any sort of real issues. And one thing that's interesting to note, unlike the other ESCI builds I've done in the past where they don't give you any spare links, this one I actually had about 3 or 4 spare track links left on stock. I didn't have any failures or casualties, and they're just totally spare. I was looking to see if there are any other locations on the model where the spare tracks go, just like on the Merkava, but I didn't see any in the instructions, and so far they're odd man out. More than likely, if I was to take a hunch, there are supposed to be spare tracks mounted somewhere. I'm going to do some research online on real T62s, and we'll see what that looks like towards the latter half of the video. But so far, I was able to get the thing assembled without any loss or issues in that regard. Aside from the track pontoons, this brings us to the hull itself. As we saw before, the hull was a multi-piece assembly, like on most of the ESCI builds, and it goes together pretty well. You want to take your time with assembly these pieces, make sure they're nice and straight and true. If you are assembling too fast, the thing could shift on you, and if that happens, it's going to cause some issues. But I didn't have any issues with that on this build. On the rear section and the front section, I did have some hand fitting that needed to have been done. This is quite normal for kits of this vintage, and just comes with the territory. Just some swipes with some sandpaper and some super glue is all that was required to get everything nice and flush. Obviously, you want to do this before the top deck is installed in place. And once everything is sanded away, at least for a nice flush appearance that we have here. On the rear section, I believe the firewall was actually sunk in. There was a little bit of material sticking out from the sidewall, so this was again polished nice and flush, and it leaves for a nice result that you see presently. When I installed the top portion of the hull, there was a gap found in this area over here. You can see in this format now that the model's not painted, and this was just plugged up with a little swipe of red putty. Once the putty's set, I quickly just polished it down with some wet sanding, and it leaves for the result here. But the gap is about a millimeter or so, maybe a 16th of an inch, I guess, more or less. So it's quite substantial to the point where if you don't address that, it's going to be really noticeable once the model is built, and once you polish it away, it takes care of it pretty quick. And this now leads us to the sponson work. So the sponsons on the model here, as I mentioned before, have some holes and divots found in these sections, just with the way the thing is molded. And we also have some knockout marks. And in my opinion, they're a little bit obtrusive. You could live with them, I guess. They're not really that bad. But even on my older Tamiya kits that has something similar to this, I like to polish them down, make it nice and smooth. It just makes for a better build overall. And that's what we did over here. The knockout marks were just filled in with a little swipe of red putty and sanded flush. This was done to both sides. However, something else that was done was to fill in the large recesses over here for the various toolboxes and other bits of equipment that are found on the reverse side. To fill in the cavity, specifically these large ones here, you can't just use putty alone. It's just too much volume, and with the material that this is molded in, the red putty in that volume can cause issues. The red putty that I always use is tooling base, and if you use a lot of it, it can cause warpage and melting of the polystyrene that the model is molded in, so you have to watch out with that. Thin, small layers, not a problem at all, but on mass, like that type of mass right there, that's where you can lead to issues. Also, it takes longer to dry, it'll crack, it'll cause more layers. It's a mess. You don't want to do it that way. So what I did was, I just took chunks of sheet styrene and styrene strip, and I just filled in these sections over here with as much of that material as possible just to eat up volume. Once it's to a certain point, it was nice and reduced to the point where I could just put a swipe of red putty on, and it's not nearly the quantity that can cause any issues. And then it would just blend it away nice and smooth like you see up here. And also over here. These guys here, I just used a strip of sheet styrene, just cut the length, shoved into the location, swipe later with putty, and we were good to go. For the exhaust manifold under section, this is absent. It's just a cavity found on the ESCI tooling. So what I went ahead and did was I took just some styrene strip, carved it to the appropriate shape, and then just glued it into this area over here, and it completes the look. For the T62 purists out there, you'll know that this is technically not complete yet because there are these little guards that emerge from the hull that are used to keep the track from destroying the tin work. Those are not found on the ESCI tooling, and it's not something I'm going to scratch build. So for this one here, I'm just going to leave it in this format. But if you are someone that wants to take the kit a little bit further than I did, that is something that can be fabricated out of some strip styrene if desired. But then again, the bottom is perma-screwed. You're not going to be able to resolve that. Also, I just want to mention, if you are that type of person or looking for that type of detailing, spoiler alert, got the trumpeter kit. it's definitely going to have those details on it, but that's a topic for another video. As for this one over here, those little guards, they're not really that important to me for this build, so I'm just going to roll with it in this format and continue from there. Rolling to the upper side takes us to the fuel tanks. You'll notice that they are pre-painted black. This is just a quick little primer coat, and the reason why I did this was I took some Tamiya flat black with a paintbrush, painted the undersides here of the tin work before the fuel cans were added, and the fuel cans were just hit with a shot of flat black spray paint. Reason why I did this was, again, once these are fitted in place, there's a lot of nooks and crannies over here, and generally trying to get paint in these areas can be problematic. So it's best to go ahead and thoroughly pre-prime them before the main paint work goes on, so at least you have something there on the surface. After that, these guys were just dropped in place, and there were no more issues. The other thing I did was a modification where I added some extra detailing to the piece. Was on the T62, and it seems also true for the 55, the fuel cells here are all plumbed together, and the plumbing is actually external. And on the model over here, I went ahead and fabricated this by drilling some small holes in the appropriate locations with a pin vise, with a really small bit, and then with some thin floor wire, I went ahead and fabricated the plumbing details. You can see how they run along the sponson over here, and then they come up over here. These ones come over here, connect, and these two tanks are connected in the appropriate manner. And I also added the connector that's right over there, which would be found on the real vehicles. That's just a piece of styrene angle right here. It's a really tiny piece. I don't know the stock offhand. It's just a little piece I had running around loose in my bin, and I just used it for the build. But I guess it's about, what, a millimeter or two, I suppose? I don't know. Someone out there could probably figure it out, but there's the size that I use. What else did I do? Let's see. Oh, most importantly, on the front portion here, one of the biggest dings on the ESCI kit is the absence of a brush guard for the headlights. And this is kind of important bit of detailing. It's one of the more iconic bit of detailing found on these Soviet tanks, in my opinion. And so I went ahead and fabricated it. The holes for the lights actually are pretty good. They went on as per the kit. And with the way the kit's designed, you actually have an extra headlight. More than likely, it's probably for one of their other T62 kits, as they made two versions. And it's just odd man out, which is great. So I guess if you lose one, you have a replacement. But either way, the brush guard here was just fabricated out of thin floor wire, same stuff I used for the plumbing. Drilled the holes in the appropriate locations with a bit, and I went through, literally I sheared like 3 or 4 bits trying to drill out these stupid holes, but it was worth it in the end. You have to break some eggs to make an omelet, and I was able to drill the sections out, and then the piece was just fabricated out of a piece of floor wire, bent to shape, glued in place, and then I added the top struts to the appropriate locations. Once this thing is painted weather, it's really going to shine. It's going to be one of the focal points on the whole build. On the rear section, we have the fuel canisters, you'll notice that these were pre-primed. These are a two-piece assembly, as I mentioned before, so glued them together, did the body work on them, pre-primed them just to make sure that there's no surprises with the seam work. Once that came back okay, the end sections were added, and they were glued onto the appropriate locations. The pieces are, there's no real set way to position them in place, so you have to be careful when adjusting it. And also these arms here, they really like to bend on you in a lateral motion, so you want to make sure everything is nice and true when you're doing the installation. Glue the pieces in place, set them, let the glues adhere, and then you could go ahead and continue with the installation of the canisters themselves. Other than that, the remainder of the kit's parts went on pretty well for what they were. There was this little piece of equipment over here. This was something that I actually almost accidentally cracked during deburring. It's very finely molded. Be careful when the deburring happens, and you should be okay. The little hooks over here are something that can easily get lost to lost partia, so you want to be really careful during the deburring process and the fitting. But once they fit on in place, they're good. You also want to make sure you have the correct orientation. They can be installed in reverse. So it's one of those things you want to take a look at a real vehicle before you go ahead and actually glue them on. Same is also true for the ones on the rear. The other thing to mention is just the little splash guard over here. We're not without any issues. Just make sure it's not leaning one way or the other, and you should be good to go. These guys here also get installed pretty well. You want to be careful during deburring of the guards. They are fairly thin, but if you are careful and you are cautious enough, you should be able to install them and deburr them in that method. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what I did. Because of how frail it is, I first glued them in place, and once they were rock solid on the model, I took some sandpaper over here and I just polished down the little burr sections that were remaining. And it just led for an easier assembly compared to trying to do it off the model, which you're potentially asking for trouble, and you can break something. From the hull, takes it to the turret. The turret has also underwent quite a bit of little upgrades here and there. The first thing I want to mention is with the elevation of the main tube. The kit does have a trunnion so the thing can elevate, but it's just horribly made. It doesn't really fit on. The thing actually wobbles left and right. And on top of that, with the way the T62 is with the canvas tarpaulin over here, it just doesn't work well. You have gaps and stuff. It's just a mess. So if anything, I just used the inner trunnion as just an alignment jig to help the thing get seated in place, and I glued it in the permanent manner that you see here. The side sections had some drops of glue added so it blends in, and there are no gaps that are really egregious. Before I did that, however, the turret halves, of course, were assembled. They go together pretty evenly. No problems there. And for extra detailing, I covered the turret here with my texture paint to give it some cast texturing, which, of course, for this vehicle would be appropriate. After the cast texturing was added, it was then time to add on the remainder of the details. Other details to mention would be the front optic over here. This is kit supplied and more or less goes in the appropriate location. There is a small little flat area on the turret molding over here, and it basically is where the piece just lines up, and it does an okay job. The other thing that was scratchable, however, was the coax MG. This is something that's completely absent on the kit tooling and would be, of course, found on the real T62. For the piece itself, I used a Plastruck tube like this guy over here, but this one here is a little big. I think I used the size smaller than this. I cut a little section, nice and flat, and then to get the oval shape, I was holding the plastic section in my plier, and I was gently hitting it with the heat gun. After a few moments or so, the plastic gets soft enough where I could gently apply pressure with the plier, and it transforms the circle into an oval by squishing it. Once the thing cools down, it stays this shape, and I was ready to make some carves here or there to make it better fit the front section here of the T62 turret. I also add a small little flat with a needle file to again better make the piece fit on in a nice straight manner. For the coax itself, I just drilled a small little hole with a pin vise and used a sewing pin. So that's just a sewing pin. Once it's painted and weathered, it'll actually do the job quite well. Other details to mention would be the rear blower right over there, as well as the snorkel tube. There are no real cut ways to install it. There's no suggestion points or anything, so you have to, again, monkey see, monkey do your way with the installation. But luckily, finding pictures of these things online, pretty easily done. The other thing is the rear convoy light right there in the turret. Went on without any issues. There's a small hole in the molding. I think I drilled it out a little bit wider just so the piece fits on better, and that was done. Searchlight up here, as well as the DSH K-mount, just get mounted these two little horizontal sections molded into the cupolas, and there's no positive engagement, so you just have to carefully line up, make sure it dries nice and even, and you should be good to go. For the DSHK mount, it is a two-piece assembly. It's actually pretty detailed, specifically for the age of this kit, and it went on pretty well in the assembly, where they lined up pretty evenly, and they'll do the job. The DSHK is a separate molding, as we saw before. That is going to be painted separately, and much along the lines of the real one, it just drops onto the cradle pretty well. So that's something that the kit is actually pretty ahead of its time with in that regard. And I like it that it's in this format because it allows easier ways to paint and weather it, as opposed to when it's built into this section over here. You have to carefully paint and work around things, and it's doable, of course, but it's a little bit easier when the piece it can be painted off the model. As for the main searchlight, or the IR light, multi-piece assembly goes on pretty well. The mount over here doesn't really sit straight, so you have to do some hand fitting in order to get the piece to sit true, but once it's in place, it does the job well. Again, on the main ordnance, single piece molding, that's great. Just some polishing with the sandpaper to make sure there's no mold lines running in the areas. The muzzle section is a separate piece, gets glued on. I like to glue it on and then polish the burr off. Trying to work with it without the piece being fit in place is a bit tricky, and you could accidentally lose the piece, and that's not helping. As another piece that's fairly finely molded is this arm over here that connects the main ordnance to the IR light, and this is something that I actually broke upon extraction, but fortunately it was a simple break, and I was able to puzzle piece the piece back together, and now fit in place. It actually looks completely seamless, and you'll never know that the piece was damaged unless I mentioned it. So, but again, you want to bear this in mind, be careful when you're working on the model in this regard. And that is it. So, with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and get some of the interior sections masked up, and I'm going to be able to get this bad boy with its coat of primer. And then, of course, paint. But no more loitering on that. Let's just get to it. Jumping forward a little bit further, here we have the model fully painted, weathering, and it's heading towards completion. The small little details at this point are either already have been installed, or they are in their final courses of drawing, and they're going to be mounted momentarily. At this point here, I do want to mention again the suspension. Like I was referencing earlier, this is exactly why I like to leave these pieces off the model at this point over here. With the unit now fully painted and weathered, you can see that the units are able to be painted thoroughly without any sort of chances of anything being missed, either on the inner wheels themselves, the top or bottom portions of the track, or even the hull itself. Everything's thoroughly painted, which means once everything's installed in their appropriate locations, there will be zero chances of any sort of bare plastic or other types of missed areas of paint to be exposed to the viewer. And you'll be surprised exactly how many times you'll miss a spot even though the thing is somewhat visible. And really nothing hurts a build more than having it fully built and completed and seeing bare exposed plastic or base material. It's never something that's beneficial. Before I go ahead and install the suspension, however, you'll notice I went ahead and scraped off the layers of paint and primer that were on the axles. This is something that I always recommend and advocate, because when you build and paint the thing, or I should say when you paint and weather the thing and have built up layers of paint, the tolerances become much tighter and it becomes more difficult to install the parts which before were actually easily slid on. And on some builds, the extra force required to push the things in place can actually break or cause damage, which is, again, not something that's beneficial in any regard. So, when you're doing something like this, be sure to scrape off some layers of paint, maybe test fit the piece once or twice to make sure that the thing can slide on in an effortless manner. And here we get to see the model suspension now fitted to the model in its final form. Obviously, the pontoon technique, as I referenced several times already, was utilized to great effect on this build, and frankly, it is the best way to go about one of these type of track assembly methods. On the road wheels themselves, as I mentioned before, they are some of the softer detailing that's found on the model and is something that really does show its age. However, with the model fully painted and weathered, as you can see here, it more or less does the job pretty well, and you get the gist of what the Starfish wheels look like on the T62. What's also kind of funny is that when I was doing the final assembly, it really gave me the old school vibes of the Genesis Rambo 3 video game. Really dating myself over here, but I remember playing that as a kid and having this T62 go back and forth. I'm trying to blow it up with an arrow, but I'm digressing. Either way, with the suspension painted and weathered, it really does polish it up, and basically, again, it does the job for what it needs to be. On the wheels, one improvement that I made was with the rims. So on the ESCI kit, there is no molded in cut line between the rubber tire and the rim, and this is definitely something that would be seen on the real vehicle. To achieve this look over here, this was something that was actually done with the paintbrush. So the entire pontoon was first primed with some flat black spray paint, and then when it came time for the paint application, rather than using the airbrush for this, I actually went ahead and applied the paint with the paintbrush. The paintbrush was done for two reasons. First, it prevents any sort of collateral overspray, which is definitely something that you would get even if you have a really fine-tuned airbrush. In this type of application over here, you will get some sort of mist that's going to go into areas that's less than ideal. And it's also, with using the paintbrush, gives you the best sort of precision to get the paint where it needs to go and needs to go exclusively. This is definitely rings true for the sprocket because you need to get the inner extremities as well as the outer portions. And by extension, the front idler is definitely relevant to mention in that regard too. But with the paintbrush, I was also able to just simply go over the inner rim section here. And if anyone's ever painted something before with a paintbrush, you'll know that a lot of times when you go ahead and just paint on the inner portion, it's not uncommon for the paint to go ahead and basically just loop over the little edge, and it'll just make a nice little rim that you see over here. And it's definitely something that was utilized to great effect on this build. It's a little subtle, but you'll definitely see it in focus, and you can really see on how much this amplifies and polishes the build, as opposed to having either the entire face of the wheel painted green, or the opposite, just have the entire rim here just painted to look like rubber. For the paintwork, like I mentioned, it's done with the paintbrush, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit to the paint portion of the video, but for paintbrush work, you want to, again, have the consistency be on point. I cannot stress that enough. Too runny, it's going to be a mess. Too thick, and you're not doing yourselves any favor. You really have to have it right there at that happy medium. As for the paint itself, I'm going to be circling back to that again as the video continues. But rest assured, the paintbrush was utilized for just the suspension. The remainder of the tank was airbrush, and again, we'll get to that as the video continues. Aside from the row wheels over here, the front idlers also received a little bit of paint work, where the rim sections were painted with a swipe of silver paint. As I've mentioned on several of these type of videos, Russian tanks, specifically the T-54, 55, T62, and also by extension the 72 and the 90, have steel rimmed front idlers. And when you're building a model like this, you want to add a swipe of paint in this section because paint would not last long on these surfaces after the tank gets driven. Aside from that, this takes us to the track itself, and as you can see, the paint and weathering work is done in my usual format. The tracks, of course, were first spray painted with the flat black spray paint. Then I went ahead and painted all of the wheels with the paintbrush. And by the way, the rims were also done on the inner portions as well. This, again, is where the pontoon technique really comes into great effect because it allows you to go ahead and get into these locations with much ease, I might add. After the paintbrush work was done on the green and also on the front roller sections, I then went ahead and weathered the tracks. This was done with the airbrush with a little bit of diluted cream or flat white. A little hazy, it's been a while since I built it. But either way, that was done with the airbrush to give that parkerization type look to the black. And then I went ahead and dry brushed the scratch metal surfaces with a little bit of some silver paint. Once everything is done, this here is the final end result. Overall, the suspension came out pretty well, and basically this is the best you're going to get with the suspension that is supplied with the kit. The only other weathering thing to mention is with the Tamiya panel line accent. This, of course, was used to great effect, and on the Russian tank here, you're really going to love that stuff because it gets into all of the little areas here of the starfish, and it really does make it shine. But the same is true for basically the entire vehicle. So with that out of the way, let's continue. Also seeing this location here is the infamous Russian log. This is the kit supply one, simply painted, weathered in the following format, and then installed at the tail end of the build. These are the bits of equipment that you really want to install at the very tail end because trying to install this with the tracks already fitted in place is much easily done as opposed to the opposite. Even though the log is the kit supply one, I did go ahead and make a quick little addition to it, which is the addition of the straps. The kit log did not have the straps integrally molded on, so in order to improve the detailing, I fabricated 2 new ones out of 2 little strips of heat shrink tubing. I cut them to shape, hit it with a heat gun, they contrasted, and then I now had the detailing of the straps. They were simply painted and weathered with the same color of the vehicle, thus blending everything in. With the addition of the straps, this really does again polish up the piece as opposed to having the log just hover there in mid-space. Hopping our way to the front takes us again to the front glacis plate where we had that large seam section that I addressed earlier in the video. Well, now that the model is fully complete, you can see how well it blends in. And most importantly, you get to see the brush guard that was also fabricated in the earlier scene. Obviously, this gives an extreme amount of detailing to the model, and frankly, again, it's one of the bigger oversights that the kit does have. Granted, there were some limitations with the molding that they had of the era. However, the point still stands. The brush guard here is a very important bit of detailing, and when you add it to this old school kit here, it really does kick it up several notches. It was a fairly complex piece to fabricate, however, it's definitely worth it with the end result. Before departing the front, you get to see the periscopes over here for the driver. They have been painted with a little swipe of gloss black. As I often reference in these videos, all of my periscopes on my builds tend to be gloss black to replicate the lenses. It just replicates the lenses from the real ones that I've seen in person. Also, again, with how small everything is, your paintbrush game will have to definitely, again, be on point. While also on this section, you get to see the fuel filler caps over here for the front fuel cell. Have a little bit of sweating going on. Again, quite commonly seen on these type of vehicles. And this takes us to the side sections here where we see the external fuel tanks. And you can see the plumbing work detailing that was also referenced earlier in the video. Just another way to, again, polish the model up to just make it kick again above its own weight. Just like with the sweating going on here on the front filler caps, you can see I add a bit of sweating effects here on the filler spouts that are also found on the external fuel tanks as well. On the reverse side, you can see the exhaust manifold right there. It's probably one of the cooler aspects found on the T-Series vehicles. It's very distinctive, and I went ahead and just airbrushed it to the weathering style that you see here. Also, you get to see the added fabricated inner portion that I also referenced before. It's just, again, a way to further improve the model. I like the way that the piece is hollow over here. This is a step above, actually, believe it or not, the more modern tooling kits, but again, that's something for another video for another day. One other thing to mention about the side section here is that we do have some tools that are found. We have here a set of spare track links right here found on the corner. And under here, we actually have a shovel. The shovel is integrally molded in, so you are going to have to carefully paint it. And again, paint game and paintbrush precision is going to be paramount in completing the part that you see here. Just a few swipes of paint in the appropriate location, and you will be good to go. Continuing rearward, you get to see the rear engine deck over here with the final weathering applied. Again, panel line accents definitely going to be your best friend. And while on the rear, we go back to the rear fuel tanks, and you get to see the sweating and dripping effects that, again, I added with just a little swipe of gloss black as well as a little bit of Tamiya clear. Continuing upward brings us to the turret. As you can see, the turret cast texturing is popping out quite nicely, and it really, again, gives them all that final polished look. Also, the metal handles that I referenced before look fantastic in their final form. And as I frequently mention, just metal handles in general just have a more crisper look to them compared to their plastic counterparts. Not saying the plastic ones are junk or anything, it's just that if you have the opportunity to replace them with metal, it generally improves the model a little bit. Continuing to the front brings us to the mantlet, and here you get to see that coax MG detailing that I referenced before. And although it's just a simple sewing pin added to this location, once fully painted and weathered, it does give the look of the appropriate detailing that would be found in this location. And with this detailing added, as you can see, it really does a good job with elevating the kit overall. Bringing us to the mantlet, you can see the tarpaulin has been painted with its canvas color. And also, you get to appreciate the repair job that I mentioned before on the connecting arm for the IR searchlight that's right over here. All of the other lenses, again, have been painted with gloss black, as the same reason I mentioned before with the bow periscopes. On the rear portion here, we do have a convoy light, and that is painted in red, as this, again, would be seen like this on the real vehicle. Also, in this location, you get to see the rear lift lug that I had to fabricate, as I mentioned before. And compared with the other two examples, you can see that it blends in very nicely. Continuing upward brings us to the DSHK. And as I mentioned before, it's a multi-piece assembly, and it's one that's actually fairly detailed considering the age of the tooling. I like the way that it is a multi-piece because, again, it allows me to fully paint and weather the DSHK off the model, and then I can just drop it in place when the time does come. For the paint and weathering work, it's done in my usual format with the use of some spray paint for the base coat, and then some dry brushing for the weathering. For the ammo can itself, I went ahead and painted it with a different shade of Russian olive green. This is something that I generally mention quite often in these videos. It's a great way to add an extra bit of color pop to the model as opposed to having the ammo can painted with the same color as the remainder of the vehicle. Russian ammo cans were in a spectrum of different colors, different shades of green and olive green here or there, so this is definitely something that would not be uncommonly seen in the wild. And with that in mind, as you can see, if you go ahead and paint the model with that type of format, it gives the model just a little bit extra color, as well as giving just a little bit of extra flavor and spice to the build overall. One thing that I definitely want to mention is the little periscope that we have right over here. Same is also true, I think, on the T55. This is something that you can easily overlook as a builder, and it's one that just a little swipe of gloss black there will definitely take care of any issues. It's kind of tucked in over here, and it's always one that generally some people out there tend to forget on their builds. And that's all there is to mention about the detailing of the build, and this takes us now to the paint and the markings. For the model's paintwork, I went with a shade of acrylic paint from Mission Models, and I believe it was called something like Modern Russian Green or something along those lines. The green itself was the exact same color that I used to make the gallon form that was used on the Henlong RC 1/16 scale T90 project that I did a little while ago. This here is just the Mission Models Paint Direct. I didn't go ahead and use my exterior latex. I just utilized the Mission Models from the bottle. However, prior to the application of the paint, the model needs to be primed. This is something that's a constant on these builds, and regardless of the type of paint you use, either if it's an enamel paint from Model Master, an acrylic paint from Tamiya, or as I like to utilize in several of my other builds, the exterior latex house paint, you need to apply the paint to the model surface with a coat of primer first added. You can't just take the paint and apply it to the bare plastic. It doesn't really work out all that well, and the models always seem to look better and have better paint adhesion if you have some sort of primer on the surface. For my primer needs, I like to roll with none other than El Cheapo Flat Black Spray Paint. That's right, the cheapest rattle can stuff you find in either Home Depot or Lowe's is what I utilize on my builds. Some other people out there utilize a more dedicated type model primer. However, I've had some excellent results with the spray paint method, and I'm going to continue to utilize that on the builds that are in the lineup and also from here on and into the future. Either way, once the primer is added, I then went ahead and applied the base coat. The base coat was applied to the turret as well as the hull itself with the airbrush. However, as I mentioned before, for the running gear, I utilized the paintbrush for the paint application on these areas. The Mission Models paint is a fantastic quality, and it airbrushes on like a dream, and also it's not too bad with the paintbrush as well. Overall, it's a good quality paint, and I've utilized them on several other builds in the past and had some excellent results with them. After the base coat was applied, it was then time to do the weathering. For the weathering, I utilized my usual format of a mix of both airbrushing as well as dry brushing. For the airbrushing, I first started with a diluted cream color to get the sun fade effects that you see on the surfaces. Then with diluted Tamiya flat black, I go ahead and apply it to the edges to achieve the counter shading effects. Once the airbrushing was done, it was then time to go in there with the Tamiya Panaline accent, and like on all military AFV models, Panaline accent is going to be your best friend. It loves to go in there into all the little nooks and crannies, really highlighting them, making everything look all that much excellent. It's really great here on a T62 on the engine deck. It really highlights the grille detailing. As I mentioned before, the grille details are pretty soft on this build, but the Panaline accent really does a great job into amplifying what the details are that are molded in, and it really, again, makes the model look just that much more polished. The Panaline accent also does a wonderful job here on the suspension, goes into all those little areas there, and again, it really does what it advertises on the tin. After the panel line accent was done, I then went ahead and added the remainder of the chip surfaces with the dry brushing techniques, flat black applied with a fan brush, and I go ahead and apply it to several of the locations. If anyone is curious on how I actually go about with my weathering techniques, I actually show them in better length in the old tank repair videos. That is a playlist found on the ECA channel. With the preliminary weathering out of the way, it was then time to go ahead and add the markings. The markings on this model here are the kit supply decals. As I mentioned in the past and also earlier in the video, when it comes for these ESCI models, specifically these vintage ones from the 80s and early 90s, a lot of times they didn't really age very well, and it's not uncommon, or at least from my experience, to have decals just disintegrate when they make contact with the water. However, I've also had situations where the decals went on without any sort of problems and they were excellent quality. And fortunately, with this example over here, it was definitely the latter. The decals went on without any sort of issues, and what you see here is exactly what the kit gives you. If I go ahead and bring the camera in closer, you can see that the decals went on nice and smooth. There were absolutely no issues whatsoever of cracking or tearing or anything along those lines. They went on as good as, well, any of the other modern kit decals that you can think of. Once the decals were applied, the entire model was then coated with VMS matte varnish. The matte varnish, as I always reference in these videos and recommend in these videos, is a fantastic product. It goes on the surfaces and it really gives that final polished look to the paintwork. And when it comes for decals, it really adheres them to the side of the model. You don't have to worry about them flaking off on you after the varnish is applied. One other thing I want to mention about the VMS is that on some other Mission Models paint in the past, namely the Merc Camo ones, I had to go ahead and add a layer of varnish before the decals because the paint, from what I saw, was actually water soluble, where you add a drop of water to the surface and it'll actually start melting the paint. And that was not something that I encountered on this one over here. This was just like adding the markings to something painted with Tamiya or the exterior latex. So when it comes to the Mission Model paints, it seems like, depending on the color, or maybe the batch, I don't know, but it's not something that's actually, that is a frequent thing. On this one here, no problems whatsoever. Just paint dried, thoroughly weathered it, threw some water on, and threw the markings on in. It was as good as it possibly can get. If you're working with Mission Model paints and you're not sure if the paints are going to disintegrate with the water, I recommend going ahead and applying the paint to a scrap piece of plastic or something, and then you can experiment to see whether or not the water will damage the paint. It's definitely something to check out because you don't want that to happen on you when you're actually applying the markings when you're doing the build. It's definitely something that's less than ideal. If the paint is the type that will do that, first just go ahead and cover the entire surface of the model with the matte varnish. Then this will give you a barrier to go ahead to apply the markings. Apply your markings, and then you could finalize it with a second coat of the varnish, and you'll be good to go. Just a little extra step, but it's one that you want to make sure you need to do prior to the actual application of the markings. In the end, I'm very happy with the final end result, and it actually turned out much better than I would have originally intended when I first saw the model in its original condition when I opened the box. The model did go together pretty effortlessly. I didn't really encounter too much in terms of problems or other type of complications, and for the most part it was a pretty simple build and a smooth one at that. And this conveniently takes us to skill level and recommendations. So from the get-go, is this something that I could recommend to a beginner? Not really. Even though the model itself is relatively simplistic, there's not really all that much going on with one of these T62s. The real aspect on this that's going to be a bit challenging for a beginner is first lining up all the hull components, because it is a multi-piece assembly. This is something that does add to complexity, and if someone does not have their fundamentals ironed out, may give them a bit of a curve when working on that portion of the build. But also, specifically the tracks. Because of the individual link nature of the tracks, this is something that some beginners are indeed going to have some difficulty with. It's just the nature of the beast. Specifically with the way the tracks on this one time around the sprocket, this was something that was a little bit more trickier compared to what someone would imagine. Other aspects of this build that make it a bit challenging for a beginner would be some of the frail, small fiddly bits that I mentioned earlier in the video, like the subassembly nature of the DSHK, the connecting rod for the main armament that connects to the IR light, as well as things like the handrails, the subassembly nature of the fuel tanks. All of these are a bit fiddly, and because of that, a beginner may have some difficulties with trying to deburr, remove off the sprue, and then fit into the appropriate locations on the model, and do so in a way that is successful. Because of this, again, I cannot really recommend this to a beginner. This is more or less a model kit that I would recommend to someone who already has a few kits under their belt. So this basically makes it something for an intermediate to an advanced range builder. And this is where things get a bit interesting. An intermediate builder should definitely have the skill sets required in order to tackle those small little challenges that the build does have, and do so in a way that, again, will lead for some good results. An advanced builder should definitely already, obviously, have the same exact skill sets lined up. And this is where things get interesting, is because this is where the model really does show its age. As I mentioned before, there's some aspects of this model that are a bit soft in its overall detailing, and this is something that has indeed been changed, or I should say has been caught up to, with the more modern kits on the market of the same vehicle type. And generally, people who are an intermediate to advanced range builder are looking for something that has higher detail fidelity. And that's where this kit kind of is in limbo. On one aspect, it's a simple build, but does have some challenging aspects to it, while on the other end, the juice may not necessarily be worth the squeeze, because the modern kits basically do the same job, but just a little bit better. So again, this one here it's kind of a solution looking for a problem in that regard. And this is something that I can say with a little bit of authority, because while I'm filming this video over here, I'm actually working on a few other 1/72 scale T62 kits from the other manufacturers, and in the same scale, of course. And while working on those, I noticed that in some aspects they are much more superior to this one over here. However, in other aspects, they are basically a wash in terms of the detail fidelity, as well as also some of the components that need to be scratch built in order to get the model up to the same condition as this one. So that's kind of interesting that I encountered that, but I'll save that information for the other videos when they do come out. Back to this one over here. So this one over here, again, it's really great in some aspects, but it does show its age in others. And if someone is more of a builder that's concerned with the detail fidelity on it, or looking for something that has higher quality of detailing, then this one here may or may not be something that you're looking for. So honestly, the jury's still out in that regard. However, even though this is a vintage kit, the quality of the model is actually one that aged pretty well, all things considered. There are several other vintage kits that I brought on the table in the past that definitely do show its age a bit more compared to this one over here, and in the long run, there's a reason why this kit is still with us today. Which is a bit of a plus, because these models are, again, fairly prolific on the market and are found for affordable prices. However, how do they do stack up compared to their modern counterparts? Well, again, that's something for another video for another day. Back to what I was saying before, in terms of a advanced range builder, this is not necessarily a kit I could recommend, because generally those people are looking for a more advanced kit in terms of its detail fidelity, and if you're that type of a builder and looking for that type of experience, I'm going to not necessarily recommend this kit to you and steer you more towards the modern alternatives that are on the market. Also, I'm unaware of any sort of aftermarket parts that are available in order to improve this kit, be it in photo etch or the other materials. So this is something that you're basically going to be on your own in terms of scratch building some accessories in order to enhance the kit like I did in this video. Having said that though, the model itself is a nice platform in order to do so, because again, from the get-go, it does give you a pretty decent representation of a T62, so the fundamentals are all there, and it's actually a pretty good canvas to enhance further. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Well, I'll basically let you guys be the judge on that. And this takes us now directly to recommendations. So, if you are a fan of Soviet com block armor, this kit here is definitely one I'm going to recommend to you. If you're a fan of just Braille scale modeling, again, this kit here is a very nice one to add to your collection because of how prolific they are on the market, as well as also affordable generally when found. On a similar note, if you're a fan of Cold War era armor, this kit again is also highly recommended. With the model being 1/72nd scale, this is a popular wargaming scale, and if that's something that you're into, these kits here are also a nice option to check out because of, again, how prolific they are on the market and also relatively affordable when found. And that's specifically relevant for wargaming because you tend to need a number of the same vehicle in order to fulfill your ranks. I can also recommend this model for anyone who's an avid fan of the T62, and if you are looking at those other kits that are on the market, it's cool to have this one also in your collection in order to have a nice spread, and you can have an example of each of them represent your collection, and it just makes for a more rounder, complete collection overall. I would also recommend this model for anyone who's an avid fan of building and collecting vintage model kits. These kits here are definitely vintage. They're 40-plus-year-old now, so that definitely classifies for that type of a collection. And because these models have been in production for so long and still are very affordable when found, this is definitely something that makes them attractive to track down compared to some of the other more elusive and expensive kits that are on the market. This one here really is a bit of low-hanging fruit, but low-hanging fruit is still tasty fruit nonetheless. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for the 1/72nd scale Russian T62 main battle tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook, where I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.